Yeah, I think that's it. So, good evening, everyone. Happy Lunar New Year. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's session of the Informed Service Science Online Forum. We are especially delighted to kick off the year with a timely and important conversation on AI regulation, a topic that sits at the intersection of law, economics, technology, and service operations. And we are honored to have with us Professor Danny Sokol and the Caroline Craig Franklin Chair in Law and Professor of Law and Business at the USC Gould School of Law and the Marshall School of Business. He also holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Economics and serves as faculty director of the Center for Transnational Law and Business, as well as co-director of the USC Marshall Initiative on Digital Competition. Professor Sokol is a leading scholar in antitrust, digital markets, and competition policy. So we are truly fortunate to have Professor Sokol guide us through these complex issues today. And please join me in welcoming Professor Danny Sokol. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really great to be with the group. In terms of what I'd like to do, I have a slide deck. Okay, am I sharing? I don't see, hold on one second. I don't see my slides. Here we go. Give you some preliminary thoughts, but I want this to be much more of a conversation. So at any point, please interject. Before we talk about AI and regulation, I think one of the reasons that we're all here, and this really tells us a lot about the Informs group. So I think of Informs as this really amazing community of scholars from across fields. We tend to find people largely within the Informs community across information systems, operations, and marketing. Each of these three fields, plus some other related fields, all grapple with the same issue in some of the work, which is that law and regulation sometimes matter. And here, understanding the legal domain, I think, is useful to making sure in research that in your core field that you understand how law matters and the mechanisms of law. When are things endogenous versus when are they exogenous and sort of ripe for example, a nice diff and diff. How do we theorize in a way? So when I think of a lot of operations, I think of the importance of contracting and supply chain. By definition, contracting is about a contract, which is law. We in each field we deal with intellectual property rights, and sort of when and how to use. We think about ownership of IP or data or other things. We think beyond just the broader AI area. So we can think, for example, of other areas of technology and innovation where these issues come up, whether it is traditional issues of, say, supply chain recalls of either end consumer products or maybe even of things like medical devices. We care about tort law. We care about, in various contexts, privacy law. We care about antitrust and competition as we think about market power and things of that nature. There are a number of different areas where I think this interface happens. Herein lies a fundamental problem, which is that for many of you, you're at universities where there's also law school. The problem is that the people within law don't actually understand what you do, and they can't really understand how businesses operate. And so it's a very disjointed conversation. And I think the true interdisciplinary sort of approach is how to take some of the domain understanding from law and sort of bring it to your areas. Although, frankly, having seen a lot of this work before, it's already there. Many of you already have this expertise, and many of you do it either through some kind of consulting on litigation, where there's some kind of issue, whether it's a breach of contract or some kind of tort, or some kind of issue involving competition or privacy, or this emerging field of AI and law. Uh, Many of you already have this expertise. For the rest of you, the question is, how do you sort of get it? And I thought maybe we'd have a conversation. I'd give you some overall framing, and from there we could walk through how this matters in terms of AI and how we think of law and regulation. So, Philip, I'll have you sort of, to the extent that there are any comments, you feel free to uh, express them, but I'll go through this. But if people want to raise their virtual hands, they're welcome to do so at any time. I'll start with some very obvious points. The first is that whatever we thought before about technology, just we've seen a seismic shock with regard to generative AI. I think this week we saw for Lunar New Year Chinese robots come out, so we're seeing even a whole nother level of technology. They're dancing. I mean, I'm just waiting for literally. For those of you who remember the um, the the television show in the United States where they used to have the robot wars, where they'd have like little motorized cars that would destroy each other. Now we can have boxing with robots, and then maybe the robots will take over. All these are really great issues, but that's not what I'm going to focus on. But I'd say, nevertheless, we see it happening in real time. There's so many every week. There's something really new. We're focusing on a narrow subset, which is that whenever we have a technological innovation, law steps in or regulation steps in. Let me give you a very reduced form of the distinction. Regulation is ex ante, which means we're thinking about how do we regulate future behavior, um, with setting sort of clear rules. Oftentimes, this is through administrative settings versus law, which a lot of times when there's a dispute, it comes after the fact largely. So normally, if there's a contractual breach, we sue. That's after the fact. We have all kinds of doctrines that are complicated across different areas of law. So property law looks different than contract law, which looks different than competition or antitrust law, which looks different than privacy law. Sometimes they borrow from each other, sometimes they don't. But fundamentally, whenever we have technological change, two things happen at the same time. Number one, we think about when do we actually need a new kind of law where no such law existed before, versus when do we try to take older legal ideas and apply them to new settings? And the answer is we do both all the time. So I'll give you an example that I think is highly relevant to platforms that we've been thinking about for quite some time. So if we think about rideshare, the question was, well, do we need new regulation or new law for rideshare, or do we just apply the same kind of laws that we would apply, say, to taxis? And the answer was a little bit of both. And we can see lots of different areas like that. And I think AI is going to be no different. So first thing I want to do is just explain that we've seen this kind of technological shift before, and we do a lot of navel gazing every time there's a new technological shift. So is AI new? The answer is both yes and no. So I want to begin with a sort of going back to the late 1990s. On the left, you see the cover to the book Information Rules by Carl Shapiro and his advisor at the time for his own PhD, Hal Varian, both absolutely brilliant people. And the basic premise of their book in 1998 was very simple, which was that even though we were in a new world of quote unquote platforms, although they didn't call it platforms at the time. Oh, okay. Even though we didn't call it platforms in the late 1990s, the basic premise was very simple. In these markets, traditional economic theory could actually explain a lot. That even though it was about new technology, economics had been dealing with this issue for a long, long time. And there's a lot of truth to what they're saying in terms of theory. And in fact, we see across fields, people still cite to seminal papers from economics from the 80s as we were thinking about networks, as they were then called, or even the 90s when we called them uh, intermediaries. 2000s, we started to call them two-sided markets. Very quickly, we learned that they had sometimes more than two sides, and then we called them platforms. Now we call them platform ecosystems. All of this matters in the context of AI as well. So sometimes it's new, sometimes it's not. Largely, it's not. So that's from the late 1990s to say that we have a general framework, and I'd say law is much the same way with some tweaks. On the right, this is where I do some of my own self-preferencing. The other year, 2023, I had a survey paper in the Journal of Economics and Management Strategy. And there, what we did was we looked at, in top journals, we looked at 20 years of the empirical literature involving platforms. What we discovered was actually very important, in spite of the fact that by far the most cited paper in all of platforms was Roshan Tirol's 2003 article in the European Economic Review. Turns out that economics actually, as a discipline, had a very small role in the empirical work. And we looked at top journals, and we were looking at more than ultimately, we were able to narrow it down to some 860 articles. It was marketing, it was information systems largely, and others to a lesser extent that were really driving the empirical work. And what we saw over this 20-year period were shifts in sort of ideas of how do we frame these research questions, what do we look at? And one tension is that some of the early models that we saw from the 80s and the 90s actually had to be updated because the assumptions were a little bit off. For example, not every market is a winner take all market. Sometimes, which is to say that sometimes tipping happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes network effects matter, sometimes they don't matter. And so we saw all kinds of nuance. So I think as we think about AI, we've already had a series of books on the economics of AI, but we've also seen related books among faculty in operations, in management, in marketing. All of these are challenging some of our assumptions that we've had before on these topics. Um, some of it is old, some of it is new, some of it has to be revised. I think law and regulations relationship to many of these AI questions also therefore need to be revised because it assumes a certain number of things. We'll talk about maybe how do we identify opportunities. So let me first explain to you maybe how we think about law. Law matters quite a bit. So if we think about the AI-enabled platform firm as our central unit of understanding, we could dissect different types of areas of law and regulation. So sometimes the regulation happens at the national or the global level. So we've seen a number of papers, for example, about GDPR in Europe, which involves privacy. We've seen competition-related laws. We've seen national security. We've seen digital markets in Europe and related issues elsewhere. We can see, for example, in Korea, as of January, there's a new AI law. We see AI regulations in China. We see AI regulations in the United States. In Europe, there's the AI Act. All these things matter. That's national. They could be global. Sometimes it's more local regulation. So we're seeing a lot of push at the state level to have AI enactments. The federal government is trying to prevent that. We could talk a little bit about that. Sometimes the law doesn't come from government. The governing mechanism is actually private contracting or private actions. So we can have companies litigating against each other. We have a lot of that right now with regard to AI. For example, Disney is suing all the foundation AI companies as to whether or not the models were trained on Disney related IP. We can have actions based on contracts. So we can think about our digital supply chain, and there's some kind of disagreement as to how we share money, or what happens if there's some kind of uh, IP issue there, or data related issue, data breach. All of these are private actions. Sometimes we have third party certification, right? How do we basically decide that there are appropriate guardrails? The governance is coming from some third body, but it's completely private. It's not done via the government. We also have informal norms. A bunch of companies have higher AI standards, whatever that means, and we can talk about that as well. That's largely a function of their own self-regulation. And the basic idea is if they have high quality, they're more likely to get, let's say, customers. Or if they have high quality, they're more likely to avoid more stringent government regulation. This is also where reputational mechanisms come in, and where, from more of a soft social science perspective, we think about things like legitimation, right? The idea of legitimacy. So we have all of this in play, all of these mechanisms that we see within the broader area of law and technology also very much apply to the area of AI. And I can point to a number of papers across fields that already we're seeing some of this. So I want you to understand it's a bidirectional movement as between law and the actual business strategy itself. So sometimes law is responding to certain actions. For example, driverless car hits a pedestrian, tort law will then apply. There are other types of law as well, but we'll just make it easy. Tort law applies as it would with any kind of hit and run. Maybe actually criminal law might apply. And 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 so law is reacting to something existing in the business strategy, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. It could very well be that companies are actually pushing the development of law or the development of regulation to benefit themselves, right? And we see both of these in every kind of law at the same time. So I want to make sure that we understand the bidirectional nature of law, and there are various reasons how we might think that this happens. Sometimes it's through lobbying, sometimes it may be that through an iterative process, judges become more knowledgeable about these topics and are able to come up with, say, more efficient outcomes. You might actually just settle, as 90% of all legal cases are not actually tried fully to a decision. We have settlement. But what we tend to measure as academics are decided cases, largely because it's a great shock. So if we think of nice diff and diff, there have been plenty of papers across each of the fields that we've already discussed, where there's an important, say, Supreme Court case that shapes the direction of innovation. It could shape the direction of liability. And we've seen a number of these kinds of papers. There are a number of you who look at, say, a regulatory change and look at the before and the after for all kinds of things, whether it's financing, whether it's about R&D, whether it's about different marketing channels that you might use. All these kinds of issues are sort of fundamental to law and various processes. I'm going to stop there before I get into more AI specific things, just to make sure that this is the opportunity to ask about clarity as to what do I mean by law, what do I mean by regulation. Everyone feel comfortable right now?
Yeah, hi Danny. I think there's one question from Lauren in the chat.
Oh,
Yeah, from an operational perspective, which regulatory layer most directly shapes how AI-enabled platforms design their systems, data governance, algorithms, and/or decision rights?
uh, so the answer is yes to everything. It depends where in the stack you are. So maybe I'll get to that in a second. First, so let's hold on to that question just to say here, I think we see that regulatory environments change over time and these different areas of law are basically converging, except it's an iterative process and so they're co-evolving, but the evolution is constantly happening. So even in areas of traditional regulation that we've regulated for 100 plus years, let's say health and safety, and we can have that parallel to AI, the law of today is different than, say, platform AI law of 10 or 15 years ago. And this just gives you a sense of how that works. But um, each of these areas of law is going to be discrete. I'm going to go through examples in each of these areas of law, or at least some of them, just to get us started. So let me start with something else that's sort of obvious. AI is now everywhere. Uh, we used to think that it maybe only mattered for enterprise software, something like that. No, it's whether it's accounting or finance, management, HR, operations, IS or marketing, it's everywhere. Um, and so as a result of this, the changes we're going to see are going to be much faster in some areas. Um, so that question came from Lauren. Hi, Lauren. Great to see you. Um, we're gonna double back to that when we go through the AI stack. Um, so the other one is how can AI firms strategically leverage incoming regulatory constraints to build a competitive moat? That's a great question. So that one, so maybe I'll talk about that one first. So the same way we build a competitive moat in every other setting, right? What do we use? We use contracts. Um, we use IP. Sometimes we use data when the data tends to be more unique than not in those settings where that's possible. Sometimes we leverage our ability vis-a-vis our competitors, and we want very high standards that we can meet, but our competitors can't. So we use regulation essentially as a tool that creates that barrier to entry, or what you call the competitive moat. Um, Sometimes what we find is firms lobby against foreign entry. So we see that, for example, with the TikTok bans that we've had in a number of areas, including the United States, where TikTok basically had to sell the U.S. operations. Um, there are all kinds of ways that we can create this kind of competitive moat. And the question is, it's all part of risk analysis, right? How much risk are you willing to take on in terms of creating this moat? Because here's the problem. The more that you have the moat, the more that you create potential, for example, antitrust or competition risk for what you do, which itself might lead not just to enforcement by private parties or government, but you might actually get a regulatory backlash, as we've seen with the DMA, as we've seen with Chinese platform regulation specific with regards to competition. And each of these backlashes sometimes have unintended consequences, which in turn have effects on the market. And I expect exactly the same kind of thing to happen in AI. Why? Because it happens in every area of law that there's back and forth. So here's the tension. On the one hand, we have lower barriers, more competition. On the other hand, um, we have less competition. This is not as this doesn't tell us whether or not more or less competition actually leads to overall better or worse welfare effects economy wide. This is just that there's a fundamental tension. Law comes in, sometimes exacerbates one side or the other, but sometimes both at the same time. And the frustration is in one area of law, the idea is let's push forward, except at the same time, another area of law says we don't. And so, what's a company to do? Unfortunately, there's a lot of push and pull at the same time. Um, I'm just going to give you some areas, but we can think of how each of these areas matter to AI, antitrust, privacy, and data security and IP. And then, but these are existing legal doctrines and existing legal sort of regulatory infrastructures. Then we might think of there's something unique to AI for which it gets its own regulatory infrastructure. So, for example, I live in California. We have a law that went into effect that says a doctor who consults AI as part of diagnosis has to disclose that to patients, right? This is actually a really, really great paper for those of you who have the ability to get data from hospitals, for example. So you might look at doctors in California, maybe by specialty. Though, are those doctors more or less likely to be hit with malpractice claims? Are those doctors more or less likely to be in certain specialties to use AI? How do patients respond to that? Are they more or less likely to sue when there's a problem? Um, are they more or less likely to give better or worse ratings to doctors on any number of the different rating apps? Um, how would we sort of structure this? You might look at hospitals with similar demographic data, California versus other jurisdictions, maybe in the same hospital system, even, just to get a sense of how that works. Um, that's what I mean by AI regulation, where there's something distinct that didn't happen before, and that's maybe the kind of research to do. But uh, we see lots of areas of law and regulation that are impacted by AI. Tort liability, for sure, as we think of driverless cars, among other things. Contracts, think about how blockchain is fundamentally changing how we do contracting. There's a lot of AI as we think about banking, health. I gave you an example. I'm just going to focus on a few, but actually, this is a great time if somebody has their own pet area. Before I focus on the areas I was going to focus on, I'll take any sort of questions or comments of what about my area? What about my area? This is that time that I could work through additional examples. Health is really a great one, but there's a lot of data. Um, Financial services, I think, is another one, but we could talk about anything. Or I can just go through some slides and give you some examples. I guess I'll do that. I'm going to focus on antitrust. Why? Because it's hot, it's sexy, it involves a lot of big tech companies, um, and I may have some core competence there as well. So there are really three different domains within antitrust. One is mergers. So think right now, for example, about um, so first of all, I'll give you a pure merger for which AI is in the background. So think, for example, Netflix is trying to acquire Time Warner. We know that for Netflix's recommendations, right, there are literally 10,000 different factors that go into the recommendation system. By the way, this is where I say, and they still can't recommend good stuff to me on a regular basis because it turns out I watch more than just Korean cooking shows. competitions, which I do. But we can understand pure mergers. We can also understand the case involving the AI stack of something that's not quite a merger. So boundaries of the firm are not always quite clear. This goes back to Coase in 1937. Williamson basically talking about the same kind of things. And in the 1970s, people forget that his book was actually called Antitrust and Hierarchies. But so much of the boundaries of the firm are not clear, right? When is an investment more than just bilateral contracting, and when is there some amount of control? We're seeing a lot of these kinds of investment deals across companies. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they're all making these kinds of deals. And there's some amount of vertical integration. It seems to be more than just arm's length bargaining, Coasean bargaining. And the question is, do mergers cover that? Maybe. What about if you you do an acqui-hire to get around the merger rules? Is that integration? What if you leave people behind? All of these issues are coming up in the AI context. We saw this, for example, with character AI, but we see this with a lot of different companies. We can think about AI in the context of collusion. So the very simple way of thinking about collusion is we see gasoline station on one side of the street, or for those of you in Hong Kong like Philip, the petrol station on one side of the street, and then we have a petrol station on the other side of the street. If independently they say that gasoline is $2 a gallon, and forgive me for not using metric, but I live in the United States, that's perfectly fine. If nothing else exists, we call that tacit collusion, perfectly legal. If the two gasoline stations actually have a formal agreement, let's fix prices. By the way, the overcharge tends to be 20%. Those people go to jail in the United States. And you also have to pay treble damages for antitrust. That's traditional collusion. Then there's sort of the complexity of, well, what if we don't have a formal agreement? It's sort of informal. We have certain plus factors. Then it's not pure tacit collusion. It's not formal express collusion. It's something in between where there's some amount of agreement. It becomes complicated. But there has to be fundamentally an agreement. So what happens when everyone's using the same algorithm and the algorithm is setting prices? We saw this with the settlement involving RealPage. We saw this in a case that the plaintiffs lost involving Las Vegas and hotels in Vegas using the same pricing algorithm to and so these are very real issues with regards to AI. And we can think of exclusion. So we can think of all kinds of contracts that might foreclose upstream or downstream, all kinds of monopolization, including in the AI space. And we're seeing pushes specifically with regard to exclusion to expand, for example, the Digital Markets Act in Europe. At least the French authority wants to do this to sort of push for AI stack issues and to designate certain areas as monopolies and therefore subject to their rules. This is our AI stack. This comes from Andreessen Horowitz. Don't we all wish that we were principals in Andreessen Horowitz so that we would be loaded? So if we look at all the different players, we could imagine that we have potential monopolization somewhere in this digital supply chain. So we think, for example, NVIDIA has a 90% market share of chips, and we might be worried about that. So here, we might think about the competitive effects, and I think of the wonderful theoretical work that Alex Yang of LBS is doing with my colleague Angela Zhang. They may also be roommates, so to speak. Uh, and um, and so it's a great husband-wife collaboration. They've done other work together, and so they theorize about the monopoly power of NVIDIA. We can think of a true vertically integrated company by ownership. At the moment, that's only Google. That doesn't mean that they have significant power throughout the digital supply chain, but it's just to say that they're the first vertically integrated by ownership. But we could imagine across this area, we're concerned about both exclusion and collusion. We are also concerned that as other companies might have mergers to become vertically integrated, that this might be an issue. So these are the kind of concerns we've always had before. We're just simply applying traditional law in the antitrust context. We have a series of papers, for example, involving AI collusion. We've seen them in economics, both on the theory side. I think, for example, there's a wonderful paper in Econometrica by one of my former co-authors, Justin Johnson, with Matthias Wildenbeest and Andrew Rhodes. I want to say from a year ago, that's really worth reading. There's a AER paper that involves simulation by Giacomo, I think it's Colzolari. He's at EUI. So we've seen these kinds of AI collusion papers in economics. We've seen AI collusion in the marketing literature. Increasingly, we're seeing papers, at least at the working paper level, also in the information systems literature. There's a wonderful paper by, for example, Ashish Agarwal and co-authors. That's really, I think, worth taking a look at. My guess is there's probably also work underway on the operations side um, along these lines of AI related collusion. It's only natural for those papers to exist. And then traditional papers involving all kinds of forms of foreclosure we could see throughout the AI stack. And in many ways, these papers look no different than traditional questions of time, bundling, exclusive dealing that we've seen in other contexts that everybody who's on this video has already seen for decades, these kinds of issues. There's actually a great such paper that I think just has uh, just is out in the current issue of ISR, eh, uh, which is a great paper. Um, if I recall, it was about exclusivity of content for revenue sharing platforms. I can't remember all the co-authors um, right now, but the point is we can easily apply this in the AI setting. So there are a series of trade-offs. We can think of, actually, this is Ollie Williamson's 1968 AER paper, right? The idea of looking at deadweight loss for antitrust. And so you sort of figure out whether or not the efficiencies outweigh the deadweight loss. So we see increasing concentration in industries. We have a series of papers of those. Recently, we might see the same thing happen within each level of the AI stack. Horizontal concentration grows over time. It's very natural that we have in any emerging industry lots of players and we see consolidation over time. But sometimes that's great, right? We see these as complementary assets. We see sometimes that we need to scale up. There are all kinds of reasons why we do it. And just trying to figure out the parameters where this is going to matter in AI, I think is hugely important. Thoughts, questions, concerns? people want to highlight their own work. I've given you a bunch of other people's papers. This is where I ask you to self-preference.
Danny, I have one question given what you just said.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
You have a paper that you want to share.
No, I don't have a paper on share.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Well, okay.
yeah, but I have a question. So,
Sure.
you mentioned about the collusion. So I want to ask one question. How concerned should we be about like AI-enabled tacit collusion? Like, do current antitrust laws like adequately address like algorithmic enabled this type of collusion like between different
So
firms?
this is really helpful. So fundamentally, if there is an agreement, who is the agreement with, right? Is this a hub and spoke? Um, in which case, is it humans? Right? If you and I agreed, it's very clear, right? Not okay. What if it's two machines, right? Two different AI. Um, is that clear? Not always. Uh, when when is it more sort of ancillary? So the the issue is you assume that there's something distinctive about AI. There are some things always distinctive, but let's be very clear. If in a world where it's not express collusion, where there's an actual agreement, then we look at these kind of plus factors. What I can tell you, having literally just written a paper of my own involving plus factor analysis, I went through every single decided case over the last 20 years. And what I can tell you is it's totally indeterminate. Judges basically come up with their own theories. These theories are inconsistent with each other. And that's just with regular plus factor analysis. We're still early on in the stage of trying to understand whether or not the parameters of what we do is legal or illegal. But there's one thing to answer your question that is helpful. We've seen actually in the last year, some states have passed laws about that specifically ban AI collusion in housing markets. So that's clear, right? There we have clarity, and that's an AI specific law. Other states are thinking about that. But now hold on a second. Now it becomes more complicated. Some of these laws are purposely vague because really they're trying to expand the laws beyond just housing to other areas, right? They think that the traditional antitrust law, which is actually very short, it's like two sentences literally about collusion, Section 1 of the Sherman Act, it's, oh, we want to expand it even more and basically change the defaults to make it more difficult to do certain things. So the answer to what I say to you is both yes and no at the same time. Sometimes it's just as unclear as everything else. It's like people say the same thing like, oh my God, AI is going to cause bias. I thought, oh wow, maybe you've never lived in this thing called reality because we have bias already. And it's the same kind of concerns about collusion. Well, maybe we have it, maybe we don't, but there are certain things that are distinctive about AI regulation that might ban certain behaviors in some areas, but not others. But even then, we might have essentially what we call regulatory creep from one area to another. Um, and the interesting thing is maybe a little bit different. Oh, we have another question here about antitrust law should think about vertical integration in AI markets. So this is a great question. Um, so really it's antitrust is fascinating, and thank you, Khan, for asking this question. So in a traditional antitrust law context, having even a monopoly is itself not the problem. It's actually doing something bad with the monopoly power. That's the problem. So we have plenty of companies that, at least in one segment of a vertical supply chain, have monopoly power. The question is, are they actually doing something that we can easily identify as to have consumer harm? And in that sense, the AI stack is no different than any other kind of vertically integrated firm. Um, I think what's a little more complicated now is that we're more likely to see these kinds of deals that are not quite full integration. unclear what to do about them, how much control, how much foreclosure of competitors might we have that is negatively going to affect consumers. These are open research questions. And I think this is it because there's so much going on. I think this is an area that would be great in terms of modeling, where we've seen in certain parts of the stack, for example, this is where having governments have all kinds of reports on these issues is really important. So in the UK, the Competition Markets Authority, roughly a year and a half ago, had an inquiry as to cloud computing, and there was concern expressed by some competitors against Microsoft in terms of Microsoft's uh, tying of its cloud computing to its Office suite. And there's been some investigations around the world about that. Whether or not it's anti-competitive, that's an empirical question. Would it be nice to have some theory papers there? Yes. Would it be nice to have theory papers thinking everywhere upstream and downstream about what are the sort of parameters for which we may have some kind of anti-competitive conduct? Yes. Would it be great if we had some empirical work in this space? Yes. As of yet, we don't really have really much empirical work at all in the space on the competitiveness of the AI stack. And it would be great to look at some of the parameters of how we might define that to figure out whether or not we might have a competition problem. It takes time to develop these papers. Literally, I had to go through probably somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 papers to sort of get to the 860 that I saw just on platforms. It also takes, or what I can tell you in that situation, early on, we saw many of the papers in e-commerce. Why? Because that's where the data was available. So think about where you can find data. Sometimes you can get it directly from companies. Sometimes you do it via third parties. Very rarely do you get it from governments, although in some discrete areas under the DSA, you can request data from companies. But these are important questions. Let's go to next slide. So this is basically just reiterating what I said before, and we can sort of see where people are in the stack. And basically it's everywhere. So I just give you more of a sense of this and the kind of issues. So when you have large companies, and notice how, by the way, I've chosen Western companies. There's a separate AI ecosystem in China with a different set of companies. Some of the assumptions may hold. Sometimes things will work a little bit differently. So here's what we've talked about. So here's some of the AI pricing papers, just to give you a sense of it. And some of the different areas that we may look. So hopefully this begins to answer your question of what are the papers? How do we think about it? The answer is really it depends. It's largely theoretical or simulation. Very rarely do we have good data. Here, what I can tell you is if I think of the hotel case or of the real page case, it is desperately in need of operational research theorizing relative to the kind of court documents that we saw before the settlement, right? So for those of you who are theorists, this is an area I'd look for certain. Some of you would say, actually, I'm in the ISO OM interface. Great. We need you to be theorizing about this as well. What kind of data is there? If you can sort of pull the data, awesome. And I think we've seen this before. A number of you here actually have papers on these kinds of issues, both as a theoretical matter and as a empirical matter. It'd be great to have more. So think about tying. So Mike Winston, who's the cousin of Andy Winston, who I think has probably been on the dissertation committee of probably like 10% of the entire field of IS. Had a paper in the American Economic Review back in 1990. He has a new paper coming out also a very strong paper in a top five econ journal with J. Pil Choi on dynamic tying in an AI context. So you could be theorizing about roughly the same thing, but give an AI spin and still get into a top paper. What an amazing world that we live in. So there are opportunities for everybody. But I think we also have these opportunities, if we have data, to be able to really play through this. A lot of times we look at actual cases, or we look at actual cases or investigations as a way to theorize. There are all kinds of ways of doing this. And you become very famous if you have a nice paper and get lots of citations. And isn't that what we want? Actually, any other thoughts on antitrust before we move on to something that's not antitrust, but equally sexy and interesting? Okay, let's move on to something equally sexy. One change that we've seen in really the last decade is a massive increase in the number of papers, both theoretical and especially empirical and privacy, but also with regard to data security. Um, And we can see why this happens across a number of different dimensions. Um, just to give you a sense of how it works, we're going to be seeing more social engineering and I think more realistic deep fakes than we've ever seen before. The question is, what is the legal response? How much of this do we regulate? So when I think about realistic deep fakes, remember how I said about legitimacy? So, and sometimes we have informal norms. It turns out if you're one of the 1.2 billion Catholics in this world, there's been not one but two papal bulls specifically about AI. It turns out our last pope, may he rest in peace, by the way, I'm not Catholic, but nevertheless, wonderful man. Um, he was really upset about the deep fake with him in the poofy white jacket. It turns out you don't mess with the Pope. And now that we have two papal bulls on AI from the Catholic Church, and you'd say, well, but this is not a government. Yeah, but I'm telling you, 1.2 billion people, that matters. But we can see all kinds of cases involving privacy violations with regard to AI training. Um, the number of people who are regularly using AI instead of going to, say, a clinic for basic care is significant, but a lot of times they're doing so without any kind of uh, knowledge that they're basically training the AI in other settings. There might be a data breach from from some of the training material. We might see manipulation. There all kinds of things can happen. In fact, do happen. This is really great as a way to study AI. In some ways, it's no different than traditional privacy breaches and data security issues, but in some cases, there are unique things that we hadn't really thought about. Um, Turns out, by the way, we've had deep fakes for a long, long time, at least since the 1880s, in terms of photography. So there's nothing new there, but there's AI twists. And the more you sort of think about these cases, and there are a lot of cases going on right now, the more you have opportunities to either simplify through theory or come up with really creative and clever ways of about thinking about some kind of empirical testing. Uh, Court cases might be one of them, especially when they create certainty over time. This is one of my favorite because the stakes are really high. A lot of this, there's a lot of fair use at play. Um, but when we have pure AI generated content, right? How do we think about that as well? How much of it is based on violating the AI of others, lots of training data cases. So overall, what we're seeing is basically a set of settlements that's really about who extracts the wealth from this. Is it the AI model companies, or is it the content creators? And we've been seeing this kind of problem play itself out for decades, but there's a unique AI twist to it. This gives you a sense of some of the California cases and elsewhere, New York, just to show you how many different cases there are. I have to actually update this, but this just gives you a sense how massive it is. And there are probably more cases being filed all the time. And this gives you a sense around the world. It's not just a US phenomenon, it's everywhere. And overall, these are regulatory efforts. I've seen some early stage work by Hemant Bhargava, who's tracking all kinds of different state level ways of thinking about AI. It's a complete and total mess. But we can also see in other countries, oh, by the way, Korea has moved to implementation rather than just proposal. This has to be updated. But you can see we've already seen movement. Probably if you sort of dig deeper, even these countries that look gray, in fact, are probably not gray. Oh, we have a question. From a platform strategy perspective, how does AI firm balance economic necessity monetization with severe risk of perceived privacy violations? Let me unpack this because this is really fascinating. So there's actual privacy violations, and then there's perceived privacy violations. There, I think of the really wonderful work of Tesseri Lin at BU as to the distinction between the two. But because frankly, both of them are going to impact firms, right? We have reputational penalties. So how does a firm balance? The answer is going to be based on a number of factors. Are they one of the frontier firms? How important is reputation? How important is regulation? Are they ahead or behind relative to others? We might think of competitive sabotage. The answer is yes and no. It's a complicated mess. And actually being able to distinguish different AI strategies across firms, I think is useful, and actually probably has significant managerial implications as well. This is just to give you a sense of where we are in the United States on pure AI regulation. The most important thing is we don't have anything comprehensive. We have a little bit across a number of different areas. Again, it's a total mess. That's my only point here. There's lots of opportunities to arbitrage any of these different approaches to AI regulation. Or some of you just look at this and say, oh my God, I'm never going to get past the endogeneity here. I don't think that's quite right. I think that there are going to be certain areas that you can see there's clearly a before, clearly an after, beautiful diff and diff, quasi-regulatory experiment, boom. When you find it, it's like gold, but you have to look, or to keep the analogy, you have to dig. I'm going to just quickly then say, I did some work on platform regulation. It's coming out in Management Science. This is the working paper version. I should probably use the Management Science version with some of my dear friends, some of whom are, I mean, they're all co-authors, but one of whom is in the States, the other two are in China. There's a follow-up that we're doing where we're using the same data set to look at venture capital investment in China, specific to AI regulation, but also the shock of GPT in China. And it turns out, getting to the results, because I know we're just about out of time, but when we look at investment and venture capital, what we find is as a result of the dual shock, it turns out that many venture capitalists wait because of the regulatory uncertainty. They wait until the regulation, which actually improves venture capital investment as a signal in China. And this is not what we expect. We just expect a lot of regulation is going to just chill investment. That's not what happened in China. Would that look different elsewhere in the world? Possibly. That's our early stage work. But we're at time, so I'll just stop there, but happy to just stay on for questions if